But it doesn't quite answer the question of, whether or not if the crime were different, for instance,
yes.
Do you think that the reaction to it will be different?
Well, it's all based on legislation. People take a very serious attitude to serious offenses like terrorism, international crimes, really, genocide, terrorism, and drug trafficking. And I think that in Indonesia, drug trafficking has been placed at the level of such heinous international crimes like terrorism.
That is in Indonesia. But what about other countries? Say, for instance, Nigeria,
yes.
Australia, even though Australia has its own battles with terrorism, and in the last couple of days, they've also, let's say weeks and months, they've suffered some scares. So do you think that the reaction of the Australian government, assuming even if they do not have the death penalty as the penalty for terrorism in their country, would the reaction be different towards the Indonesian government for saying, sentencing someone to death over terrorism charges?
Well, I think the reaction will be different. I mean, different countries apply different standards to different crimes. The United States, for example, there are certain states that actually carry out the death penalty, and there are states that do not within the same country. So, to answer your question, yes, Australia's reaction may be different if Indonesia does apply that to terrorism. Yes, correct.
Do you ever see the death penalty leaving jurisprudence in many countries, for instance?
Yes and no. I mean, there are international conventions against the death penalty, but countries are at liberty as to whether or not they sign up to those conventions or not. The United Nations as an organization discourages the death penalty. They consider it barbaric, as you've heard from the UN Secretary General's condemnation of what happened in Indonesia. It is a matter of sovereign, the exercise of a country's sovereign immunity as to whether or not they want to apply certain penalties in their domestic laws.
Well, this laws, no doubt, are very, very stringent in the way they are couched, and you will see that what we see there with the Filipino, it will seem that if no one had come forward to say, I was the main culprit, then by now she too would have been dead. Looking at the sovereignty of Indonesia as a country and looking at their laws, it would seem that all we're trying to analyze here is mere noise if we had to go back to the sovereignty of that particular nation. Why would Australia be so bitter about this, knowing full well that this is a sovereign nation?
Well, it is a sovereign nation, but then again, their laws actually allow for pardon. So Australia's representation would have, or frustration for that matter, would have been based on the inability or ability of the president of Indonesia to actually pardon or commute those sentences by way of pardon. So that belies the frustration of countries, because there is that last window there for the chief executive of Indonesia to actually exercise his power to pardon. In the case of the Filipino, as you rightly said, that really is the argument against the death penalty, because in her case there has been a miscarriage of justice, or an alleged miscarriage of justice. Had she been executed 2 days ago, she wouldn't be able to benefit from the review of her case as she's currently been enjoying, which is really what the argument against the death penalty has always been. That what if you discover thereafter, several years after, as it often happens in the United States, that there has been a miscarriage of justice. Somebody popping up and saying, I assume responsibility for it, or some forensic evidence indicating that something else has gone amiss. You don't have a second chance. And that is what the challenge is internationally.
Do you see this Indonesia's law particularly maybe standing the test of time? Because if Australia backs out saying, we won't support you anymore because of the kind of support we've given to you initially, and then what happens?
It's very unlikely that the Australians would go beyond just a diplomatic protest. Recalling their ambassador is the strongest statement that any country can make to register displeasure at another.
What if the country doesn't back down, doesn't budge?
But it is very unlikely that Indonesia would back down. There are 58 countries left in the world that actually exercise the death penalty. So it's not only Indonesia.
But you see these executions, the second part where you say serves as a deterrent.
Yes.
Is it working?
I'm sure it does, to a limited extent. when we look inward as to what we had here several years ago, 30-odd years ago, when we still had exercised the death penalty by military decree, did it have a deterrent effect on those who committed crimes? The argument is still out. Some would say it did, some would say it didn't.
So it's going to be subjective for a while.
It is indeed.
But I was just going to ask, what influence do you think that local politics also plays in that? Because, to go with what our correspondent said, that he also, the president of Indonesia, has been commended by his own people for going ahead with the executions. Do you also think that local politics has an influence in terms of how leaders react and their stance on certain issues?
It does, to an extent. And if you look at the discussion on Indonesia, it becomes apparent that foreigners, non-Indonesian citizens, are mostly culpable for this crime. Hence the reaction of the local community. So it's the import of foreign crime, as it were, into Indonesia that gives the popularity vote to the president, because this is imported. So that is essential. There are very few Indonesians that are condemned to death for drug trafficking. It's mostly from outside.
Looking at the reaction of also the Australian Prime Minister a couple of weeks when it was rumored that, you know, it's most likely that these people were going to be executed anytime soon. They were very, you know, careful not to make any definite promises to their people. They kept on saying, well, we're going to be pursuing diplomatic means, we're going to see, we're in talks, we're in meetings. And that's all they kept on saying. They were not sure. It did not look likely that they were going to get it. And it would seem that they said that much. And so one will wonder why it is that after the executions, they are sending their protests in such strong manner, describing their resentment of it in very strong terms, cruel, unnecessary, and other such words. Is that also about local politics?
No, it's not. It's about international politics. It's about countries being governed by international conventions. It's, for want of a better word, a bit of arrogance towards the lesser mortals, where the bigger boys look at them and sort of hit them with a big stick in that you should have complied with international obligations. You haven't come out of the woods, as it were, because you still have this barbaric treatment of your citizens and international citizens in your territory. And that's pretty much what you see there. There are very few Western first world countries who still execute their nationals, let alone foreigners. So it's a bit of international arrogance, if I can put it that way.
And if you look at this, what I'm thinking now is looking inwards, back home, and trying to see how much of effort we have made. Because if this is, well, mainly from maybe outsiders, by foreigners who bring in such drugs into Indonesia, it would seem as if we haven't actually done well enough. Though we have seen a series of messages and facts from NDLEA in its effort to curb some of this, it would seem as if we also have maybe some other loose ends where some of these carriers go through to get into such countries.
Well, it wasn't very apparent whether or not Indonesia is a transit country or a user country. Empirical evidence has it that it's both. It's both a transit country for exits or entrance into Australia, but that Indonesians themselves actually do consume a sizable amount of hard drugs. And in that regard, they are clearly internally concerned as to the damage that it causes to their own citizens, especially, as I pointed out, that this is actually something that is imported into their territory.